On the contrary, it's not negating, it's building off of it. It's recognizing what's going on. What is going on? We're all sitting here. We're communing together. We are in a relationship here. That is what's going on. And now that we've recognized that there's a relationship going on, what are we going to do about it? Because it's not enough to sit with the experience. There's a need, right? That the fundamental primordial need of man is to call out, to give it a name. So why don't we just pick up from where we were? You told me that you were working on pantheism. This is your most recent project.
Yeah, so we're doing a series on Jewish pantheism.
Yeah, specifically Jewish pantheism.
No, so we're doing on all of pantheism.
Right, that's.
But right now we're looking at Jewish pantheism.
I gotcha. So I'll just say right off the bat, I think that the challenge that comes when we do any comparative stuff at all.
Wait, before we get anywhere, can you tell us who you are a little?
Sure. My name is Shammai Siskind. I was born in Baltimore, Maryland. I came to Israel as a kid. Been here for about 18 years now. By training, I'm an intelligence analyst. That's what I do for work.
Nice. On
the side, I try to learn a little bit. I teach.
You sure you don't work for the Mossad? You sure you don't work for the Mossad?
For the time being, I'm sure. I do a little bit of teaching in the Old City, in Yechida Hotel.
What do you teach?
Mainly Jewish law.
Nice.
Like Talmud.
Nice.
Jewish law.
Nice.
And also once a week we try to have a get-together talking about the more philosophical side of the Jewish tradition. Mm-hmm. That's my goal, to try to integrate those two.
How long have you been teaching there?
I've been teaching there since 2011, but I've been basically there since then.
And are you involved in any other intellectual or religious pursuits here in Jerusalem?
Like of my own, or in the context of a program, or like a framework?
No, I mean like communally, or socially.
Oh, communally. So we have a kihila, a communal framework, which has a lot of things going on. There's a synagogue there. There's a big midrash, hall of study that we have different programs going on. I'm there every morning for at least a few hours. Different functions going on.
Do you want to give a plug to the name of it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's called Kihilat Chavirim.
Nice.
It's officially an official Israeli nonprofit, but there's a lot of different activities going on in that, and I help run things there.
Nice. Here's a challenge, which I think you've taken upon yourself even before I've issued the challenge, which is good. It really is challenging for myself and for guests sometimes. It's the no Hebrew challenge, or anytime you use a Hebrew phrase.
Oh, to directly translate it. I think I was trying to do that.
You did very well. Yeah.
Okay, fine.
I felt like I almost didn't need to mention the challenge, but just so the audience knows that we do try to keep everything.
Oh yes. I'm very conscious of that. Trust me. Even my students sometimes have to ask me for translation, so I'm very nice. Conscious that that's nice. A thing. So okay, great.
Yes. Back to what we were saying. Jewish pantheism.
Yeah, Jewish pantheism. Yes. So that was so when you told me that this is something that you were working on, it was very, very intriguing, I gotta say. I think that right off the bat we're going to have a conversation about this. It's good to just get out there that whenever we're doing anything comparative in any area of spiritual endeavor, it's good to highlight that. I think there's an implicit assumption going on that there's this thing called pantheism. Like for sake of conversation, we'll just use pantheism as an example. There's this thing called pantheism, and then there's like the different flavors. There's like, the Buddhist flavor, there's the Hebrew flavor, there's all the different flavors, but it's all like pantheism. I think that approach kind of is a stumbling block for a lot of people, because they're assuming that all these things fall under a similar unified rubric, when very often the different things that they're analyzing are in fact very, very distinct concepts with very, very different understandings of what's going on. Mm-hmm. So while it is fair for, just from an academic perspective to put all these things under one topic because they bear enough similarity, I think it's important to first dispense with that assumption, to know that these ideas are in fact very, very different, coming from very, very different perspectives. As people will probably know, the central focus of Jewish theology is the absolute unity of the divine. And that is a topic that is, let's say, sensitive, to put it lightly. That's not up for discussion. That's not like the idea of some type of multiplicity in the reality of the divine is not something that's found in the Jewish tradition. At the same time, it would be very dismissive to end off with that simplistic statement and kind of ignore the other elements of the tradition that focus on or let's say bring up things that kind of trigger a pantheistic view of being, of reality.
Yeah. So let's tackle one thing at a time there. And then I think it would be helpful to define some terms. I think any intelligent conversation begins with the definition of terms.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, I brought that up so that we could know
Good.
that the definitions for one are often going to be very distinct for
on terms of comparison, I think that's a valid point which sort of plagues any comparative enterprise, because to do a comparison simultaneously you need to be recognizing the almost incomparable distinctness of each entity, and yet find some commonality that you can have a conversation.
For sure.
So I think that's very healthy and very important to establish that what we may call Jewish pantheism and what we may call, let's say, Christian or Muslim or Hindu or any other form of pantheism may be entirely different beasts. But still, there's probably something which can unite them, which is where I think the challenge of defining something is particularly difficult, because to define means to look for commonalities among iterations. So with that sort of caveat, let's then turn to perhaps trying to attempt to define what we mean by pantheism, to then talk healthily and intelligently about Jewish pantheism.
Sure. So I would say that when I think about pantheism, I would think that the people that are delving in this topic, they're trying to answer a specific question, which is, what is the nature of how the divine permeates being, the whole being, like everything that we experience, the whole spectrum of phenomenology? How does the divine permeate that? I think a very simplistic view, this is, hopefully we've all graduated from this simplistic view, but like almost like the kindergarten view of spirituality is that there's the divine, Godhead, God, the whatever, the divine structure, and then he, she, it created everything, and then there's like that and everything else, right? And there's this very, very distinct reality, the two realities, right? Whereas pantheism poses the question, it must be that there is some inextricable connection between the divine source that gives rise to being and the being itself. So what is the nature of that connection? What's the nature of that connection, and what are the mechanics, if you can say, of how the divine essence permeates through that creation? That's essentially the question. So if like the hyper pantheist would say everything is God, I think that's a lie that you shared with me. If like the ultimate pantheist would say everything is God, so everything is God, but I, Shammai Siskind, perceive myself as Shammai Siskind. So what am I going to do with that? Right? How do I answer that question? So once you have this deep intuition that divinity does in fact permeate being, then how do you go about answering the reality of chairs and microwaves and giraffes and all the other stuff that we interact with?
Yes, it opens up to a whole
in the outer world and the inner world.
Yes,
right. So these are I think the questions that pantheism is trying to answer. Is that a fair?
It's the questions it tries to answer and the questions it brings up in turn.
Brings up and tries to answer.
Yeah. I think that's a very good way of phrasing it. I think to what extent does the divine permeate being, and attempting to define the relationship between God and world, to use those terms technically, with the pantheist obviously saying that there's some sort of co-identity or deep immanence and presence of God and world. And there's obviously a spectrum of beliefs within pantheism, and we discussed in some of the videos of panentheism, a belief where God is both present in the world and yet also transcendent. I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, I want to you kind of dismissed the notion of a God that's entirely separate from the reality which God creates, as immature, so it needs to be taken beyond what might be called as sort of a deism or a classical theism. Do you think, firstly, that in every formulation of that, it's inherently an immature postulation, or are there sophisticated presentations both within Judaism and without that do maintain that ontological distinction? Because I could think of some of those. Right. So I don't want to be disparaging of those theologies.
Right. I don't mean to be disparaging. I called it childish in the sense that to understand that is the end all be all of the picture. To understand that this is the only perspective, only experience of the divine reality. It's for sure, no question, the idea within classical Judaism of the ultimate separateness of the divine. Right? We say shochen ad, right? That God is the one who dwells. Ad means infinitely far above, right? He's marom, the kadosh, right? He's infinitely distinct from his creation. So in that sense, that element is for sure there.
Yeah.
So it's a question of perspective, right? I mean, all spiritual seeking in one way or another is an issue of a paradox of sorting that out. There's no question that the ultimate distinctness of the divine is there for sure. And I think that if we can point to the central characteristic of Jewish pantheism, if we can call Jewish pantheism, how do we sort that out? Yes. How do we sort out the distinctness of God, which is for sure there on the one hand, and the ultimate closeness of God, which is also there.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So King David talks about how if I ascend to the heights, you're with me. If I ascend to the depths, right? If I make my bed in the depths, you are lying with me, mm-hmm. right? So there's this tremendous closeness, right? Almost intimate interaction with the divine, but at the same time, there is this ultimate distinctness.
Yeah.
So I think that tension characterizes what we would call Jewish pantheism.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that, and I think that's also the framework which I used to formulate the very introduction that we did now on Jewish pantheism, which should, by this time the conversation comes out, should already be on air. Yeah, so I like that framework of trying to navigate that space for divine transcendence. I actually want to ask this question on the other side. What's immature theological conceptions might there be in Judaism that we can safely say that should be done away with as someone who's maturing theologically? Is there anything that we could say definitively that needs to go theologically?
Yes, I think right off the bat we can say that there is no element of the subjective that we should give credence to, that we should give respect to, that the subjective dimension mm-hmm. of the individual is not a relevant factor. Meaning,
explain that.
So I can unpack that if you want. That the goal of divine service is ultimately a submissive act, meaning there's like the ideal that's up there and it's unattainable. But the work is to in some way get there or try to get as close to it as possible, right? Like the famous quote from Tractate Avot, right? The work is not attainable, but you're mm-hmm. not allowed to stop, right? It's like how the engineers call the law of entropy. It's like you can't win, you can't break even, and you can't get out of the game, right? So it's, right. So it's the same thing. You got to keep on striving for this ultimate thing, and you're down here, and you got to get as high as you can. So I think that perspective basically says that the subjective element of the individual, and also the community, the collective, but the subjective element is not relevant. It's just not. Like you start at like the beginning of the race, and you need to get to the end of the race, and the end of the race is whatever it says in the books. Whatever it says, like what the tradition lays out for you. There's this ideal that you need to get to, transcend your own subjective, lowliness, essentially, right? And again, going back to what we're talking about, the distinct divine versus the integrated divine, not saying that these themes aren't there. Obviously, there is an ideal, and we want to grow and develop and not be the lowly versions of ourselves that we are, for sure. But at the same time, to dismiss that the subjective inner world is not relevant, it should not be a focus of our spiritual growth, that I think we can dismiss with right off the bat.
That's really fascinating. And it's fascinating that was the very first thing that came to mind. I have a strong feeling that we could probably spend the next hour just on this and like totally get derailed, and it'll be worthwhile.
I'm sure we could.
I do want to begin by pursuing that course a little.
Sure.
And if the conversation comes back to what we plan to talk about Jewish pantheism, good. If not, oh so good. This notion of this absolute surrender of submission to a God who's up there, using very sort of spatially distant metaphors. It's interesting. There's something of like I'm hearing both echoes, and I have a comparative mind. This is my curse. I'm hearing both echoes of Islam and Christianity.
You and Jung,
Jung and I, where I'll invite to compare myself to, where the Muslim in Arabic literally means the one who surrenders, the one who submits to God, and the Christian, based on the doctrine of the original sin, has this very strong notion of the lowly human who can't do anything on their own and needs the grace of God to reach God. And there's definitely elements of both in Judaism, as both of them emerge from Judaism. But I want to challenge this paradigm with the pantheistic side, because if we do believe that this metaphor, which these are all really metaphors, that's the only thing we can use when we speak of the divine. This metaphor is tempered by the metaphor of immanence, which is the strong theme of pantheism. That means that it's not just a paradigm of us lowly, insignificant, our own subjectivity meaning nothing, and we have to strive for the above, the beyond. Wouldn't that be tempered in Judaism with a realization of the divine immanence, which means the divine presence, both that we can strive towards the destination as an inner journey and not something above and beyond, and also that there's something of the subjective experience which is also divine, which can be validated. I mean, in Judaism we believe that that we have a divine soul which is pure. Right? So yes, it comes from God, but it's within us, and we can access that purity and divinity.
I'm glad you're hitting me with all these easy questions. It's good. It keeps the conversation flowing. No, I think that the prayer that you quoted just now, which is a blessing that's listed in the Talmud. The Talmud makes very explicit that that's the first thing that someone should say upon awakening. Today the customs are a little bit different, but the Talmud makes clear that this is the first thing that someone should say upon awakening is Elohai neshama shenafata bi tohrai, that the soul that you gave me is pure. That's the first thing the person should say the moment they regain consciousness. And talking about the idea of the soul, obviously we don't need to get into the technicalities of the soul, but in terms of how it pertains to this conversation, the rabbis they noticed in the Bible how there are many seemingly overlapping phrases that refer to the soul. People that are more mystical, that are more familiar with the mystical tradition, will know the 5 classic terms that are used to refer to the soul. Right, it's nefesh, which is the lowest level of the soul, usually referred to as the animalistic side. Right, you have the ruach, the spirit, which is related sometimes to the emotions, the power of speech. The neshama, which we just talked about now, related to the more intellectual side. And then you have 2 layers above that, which are merging in, if we're going to refer to it from like the more psychic framework, the more collective side of the spirit, how that relates to the collective of the Jewish nation, and perhaps the whole world, right? The chaya, which literally means the beast, the divine beast, right? Which is a word that's used to describe angelic beings, and the Yechida, the unity, right? These are all words in the Bible, right? These are not mystical terms. Like David said, for instance, I'm just trying to remember the verse. Save my Yechida from the hounding dogs. Right. So these are not mystical terms per se. They're terms that are the soul, but they're different facets, different perspectives of the soul. So when we say that a person has a divine soul that is not touched, it hasn't been tainted, and he's born with that, and he's given it as a free gift from the outset, or she, yeah. So that is talking about there is indeed a certain dimension of the soul which is 100% pure and unadulterated, and it is divine in some way. But that's one side of the soul. There's other sides of the soul which are more subject to corruption. We can talk about what's the nature of that corruption, if it was different before the fall of Adam, after the fall of Adam. But without getting into that, there are certainly as we go lower, so to speak, or I'm going to retract on that. As opposed to lower, let's say more outer. As we go more out in terms of the outer layers of consciousness, so the layers of the soul become more corrupted. So, for instance, the nefesh, as we said, right, which is the animalistic side of the soul, it is a divine essence, meaning we relate to this as a metaphysical entity, a created entity, but it is a metaphysical one, and that gives rise to the drives and urges and aspirations. I'm going to call them urges in that they're a lowly thing only. The aspirations relating to the material plane. That's how we relate to that. And those things, that dimension is more easily corruptible. It's more easily corrupted, as we can all imagine, right? So like the Nietzschean will to power, for instance, right? We understand that is the nefesh. Like that is the full force of this, right? The nefesh ha'ba'amit, right? The animal soul that wants to win, wants to conquer, it wants to succeed, essentially, right? and we give credence to the fact that exists, but because it's at that most outer layer of our consciousness, it's the furthest, so to speak, from its divine core. So that means it's more corruptible. Right? In fact, in the Kabbalistic jargon, as I'm sure you know, the things that are there's This idea of the chitzonim, of the outer things, right? It's hard to even translate that, right? Chitzon literally means the thing that's outside. The thing that's on the more outside of the phenomenon, of the phenomenology, is more corrupted. I usually give this example when we talk about this. If a person goes to a wedding, so there's many facets of that experience, right? You have your friend who's getting married and you're just, overwhelmed with joy for this guy, and, you're dancing and singing and everyone's happy. And then there's also like the food that you eat, right? So anyone in their right mind would not say that you're going to a wedding in order to eat. Doesn't matter how good the food is. That's not what's going on, right? But at the same time, the food is part of the experience. It enhances, it amplifies the overall experience. So the inner dimension of that experience is the joy, say even spiritual experience of, sending this couple off into marriage. But the outer part of that experience is, any material thing that goes along with it, which is part of the experience. It's part of it. You can't negate it, right? Someone shows up to a wedding and says, "Yeah, I'm sorry, there's no food." Like it's a little strange, right? I mean, it's like, right? There's no physical, material side of this experience at all. So that's trying to negate that, and that's obviously it just doesn't compute really, right? So on the one hand, it is part of the experience. On the other hand, it's the most subject to corruption. It's the most, right? It's the part that's most easily brought down, and that's I believe is where we find this theme also in the Bible and also in rabbinic literature about the corruptibility of that dimension, and why that is so regulated in Jewish law, in order to, not because we don't want to address it, but because we know that it's the most subject to corruption. So from a pantheistic point of view, I think we can say that as the divine as reality is given, I'm switching the syntax, as the divine gives rise to reality, so it spreads out, so to speak. Like the imagery is like spreading out from a core. In fact, the Talmud says like the creation, started off as this, infinitesimal mustard seed. That's what it says, and then blew out from there. Idea very similar to like the Big Bang type of conception, but it starts off as this kernel and then spreads out. It spreads out. So the closer you are to the center, the more the conscious perceives the phenomenology of the divine. But as you spread out further, it's not that there isn't divine, but it becomes easier to forget that there's divine there. That's what characterizes the outer layers.
I think that's a very nice way of phrasing it. I want to ask a question on one thing you said, and then challenge another thing you said. The first, which I already hear that you're sort of switching your directional paradigm. I think the problem speaking about up there is that it does lend way to a very let's say crude or immature conception of the divine in some sort of heavenly abode, and us down here, and if we can somehow get on a rocket ship and we can get up to God. So I like to challenge that directional metaphor, and I think the inner outer is much more helpful. It's much more helpful psychologically as well. And on that psychological point, I know that you have a great interest in modern psychology, Jungian psychology in particular, if I'm not mistaken. When people hear the word soul, modern people, secular people, it's like an automatic, their brain is like, okay, this is a conversation that's like 400 years old, I'm not present. How would you to sort of redeem that part of the conversation of someone that may have switched off for it, if they're still listening? How would you take that word and repackage it for a modern person that can be palatable?
It is the faculty of human consciousness that perceives meaning. So I think that's the most simple understanding. If you think that that's a 400-year-old conversation, then you're in trouble.
Well said.
No, I'm serious about that. I think that because we've rejected the jargon, and perhaps rightly so, we've rejected the 400-year-old jargon. That's fine if you want to reject the jargon. But because we've rejected the jargon, it's the ultimate throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Of we don't like the words, so the concepts are no longer relevant. If you think, right, if anyone thinks that there isn't a distinct, quantifiable element of the human consciousness that is designed and yearning, in fact, to identify meaning, then you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And that is the soul. That's the definition of soul.
Yearning may be a bit easier for people to buy into than designed.
Well, it gives. I mean, it's the only. I mean, ultimately, it's the lens via which we interact with reality. I mean, there is no being at all without the initial jump starter of identifying meaning.
Let me ask you then, before you identified 5 levels of the soul, the classic Naran Chai of the Kabbalists, do you think that they're all involved in that meaning pursuit, or do they refer to different faculties within the human? Some of them seem to be less directly related to cognitive functions. That's
a very interesting question. I would say right off the bat that these different layers are related to different aspects of consciousness or the psyche, right? So I think we mentioned before that the lowest level, the nefesh, is related to the realm of action. Ruach is related to either the emotional dimension or the dimension of speech. And the neshama is related to the more intellectual sphere. I think that just those dimensions already gives a certain distinctness, and each one in their own way, meaning certain people commune with spiritual experiences via the intellectual, some via the emotional, etc. I think that a very important lesson is to not discount any of those dimensions, right? That just because you happen to, have a more intellectual bent doesn't mean that anything else should be dismissed.
Sure.
Or the idea, even from a definitional perspective, if someone thinks that spirituality means this overwhelmed by emotion experience, that's not necessarily true. There's different expressions, different modes of expression.
Yeah. Let me use this language now that we're building and working with to again challenge the first thing that you mentioned as the first thing you dismiss from a mature conception of God. We're talking about the Yechida. Yechida, the aspect or the entity which remains one with the divine. Can we define it as such?
Well, it's also, so the language Yechida, which means the oneness or the one,
which is in the feminine.
Right, it's in the feminine. So it's not clear if that is referring to the oneness with God or if that's referring to the oneness with all other souls.
Interesting.
It's probably referring to both.
Interesting. Right.
Because once there's a oneness with God, that means everything's a oneness because God's oneness permeates all reality.
Right.
So it's the oneness also with God and also with
okay, so that's a very interesting, and that's actually going to help this question. Do you think that according to Jewish belief, the individual has a inside perspective of Yechida? Is there a subjective consciousness or phenomenology that the human can experience called a Yechida state of consciousness? It's
possible. It's for sure possible. There's no question that's possible. Right. The question is how to define it. I mean, this is already a more direct question on a specific element of spiritual experience of how do I experience Yechida consciousness.
Right.
So I think that somebody asking this question, what comes to mind, a statement that I heard from one of my teachers many years ago, Moshe Shapiro of blessed memory. He said that when our father Abraham, when he would say, "I need," what he meant was the world needs. Now that state of awareness is achievable. The trick is to also know that you exist at the same time, right? To know that you are an individual person, and at the same time, your head is, peering into another. There's a great mural, which I know you do, but the people listening might not have the privilege of living in Jerusalem. There's a great mural on the central avenue of central Jerusalem in Krov Yafo that you see a woman, and from her neck down, she's in like a suit, walking down some urban street, and from her neck up, her head is coming out of the water, and the ocean beach, somewhere, right? So it's like that it's not losing the individual identity. Right? You remain a distinct being.
You remain present in all of those levels of consciousness.
Yes. So it is possible. So to answer your question, yes, it's possible. It's possible to have.
Okay.
That.
So with that admission, I wouldn't call it a subjective awareness. I would call it, because you said it's also the collectivity of souls, I would call it intersubjective, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a place where it will come to, and the notion that when Abraham, the patriarch, says, I want, he's saying that God wants, is a idea which is constant throughout many mystical traditions, where when one identifies with the totality of being, they can make my will your will, right? My will be thine. That
right. Yeah. No, it's a famous quote, probably one of the more famous quotes from Tractate Avot, that it's an imperative it's not that it's an imperative only on the individual, that I need to make my will God's will. It also works the other way, that God makes your will His will.
Do you want to explain that for a brief second? Yeah.
So I think that this also goes to the heart of what we're talking about now, right? I mean, the full statement is Aseh ritzoncha ritzono, that you should make your will, meaning the individual's will, that of the divine, meaning you should submit, quote unquote, your will to the divine will. Kidei shehu ya'aseh ritzono ritzoncha, right? So that He will make His will your will. Mm-hmm. Okay? So there's an interplay of wills here, right? A classical theological standpoint might not have a problem with the first part, but the second part isn't nuts.
How do you make sense of that?
Yeah. So basically, what that's saying is that there already is a potential for interplay. It's not like God is saying, "Oh, well, this, I'm going to change my mind for this." Right? The idea of God changing His mind is an interesting topic. Comes up a lot in just in the Bible of God changing His mind. But if you start from the premise that already what your subjective, this goes back to our original statement of the subjectivity elements. Like if you're going to say that the subjective inner world already contains a spark of the divine essence, divine truth, then there's no problem with that, with the second part of that statement, because it's already there.
Yeah.
So, and part of our work is to express that. And in fact, the first part leads to the second part, meaning my spiritual endeavors, my spiritual work, my practice of submitting my will to the divine will allows for the divine will already in me to emerge and come out into full expression.
Yeah. So I think that leads very well into what I'm trying to bring out here, which is, I think it's a quote from the Piasetzner. He says that it was the rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto, I think it was, who says that we typically speak about Moshe Rabbeinu, about Moses, as the Bible calls him the humblest man to have walked on the face of the earth. And within the Kabbalistic tradition, we speak about him in sort of apotheosis or deified terms, where Moses is, the Tehillim refers to him as half man, half God, and then we speak about, Kabbalists get into that. How much the divine man is the literal reading, but the Kabbalists say that he's half. It's sort of a demiurge almost. He's half God, half man. And typically the way it's understood in a non-heretical fashion is that Moses, because he was so humble, he was simply a channel for the divine. He was so clear internally that the energy of being of the universe could just flow through unabated. And which works well with classic statements from the rabbinic tradition of Shechina medeberet mitoch grano, that the Shechina spoke directly from the throat of Moses, which is why Moses can say V'natati mitaretchem b'ito, or Anochi Hashem lekecha asher tzitzicha, that I am the God who took you out of Egypt. I will give the rain in its proper time, because it's really God speaking through this totally cleared out vessel. But the Piasetzner says something very interesting, that it's not, God wasn't speaking through Moses in the absence of Moses, because Moses was so absent, therefore God could speak. It was because Moses, and this has sort of a modern ring to it, because Moses was so fully embracing of who he was, it was God speaking as Moses most actualized, not as Moses most emptied. Which is a really interesting twist, which I think I want to bring this up to challenge what you said about the need to totally that there's no place at all for subjectivity. Perhaps the deepest subjectivity is the divine subjectivity and the divine intersubjectivity, and that's where God shines through specifically.
Right. I think that's what I was trying to get at before. That the very idea of a distinctness between the subjective on the one hand and the objective divine on the other hand is already a mistake. I think that there is an interplay there, and it's that interplay which is the whole basis of the work. But that's a very interesting quote that you gave me. That I'm thinking now. There's a statement of the Zohar, if I'm not mistaken, in Parshat Miketz, that says about all of the divine archetypes. I mean, we could just to explain what I mean. There are 7 famous characters in the Bible that parallel the 7 fundamental attributes of the divine. Moses being one of them, obviously. And it makes a statement over there. Kol chad v'chad.
So when you say the divine archetypes, you mean the spheres? What's the Hebrew equivalent?
No, so the archetypes are these characters,
okay.
right? I mean, we're talking Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, Aaron, Joseph, and King David. Those are like the 7 primal archetypes. Obviously, the other characters also find their way into the archetypical, list, but those are the 7 primary ones, and they parallel the 7 primary attributes, right? From what we call the sphirot, so the Kabbalistic attributes of the divine. And it makes the statement that all these individuals, kol chad v'chad, every one of them, hazal l'kudsha b'richu, saw or experienced the divine, b'goas baklaria delay, through their own lens. Typically, the statement that you quoted, I think you quoted a second ago regarding Moses, right? The aspaklaria de meira, that his prophecy was like through a clear lens, meaning it was uncorrupted, completely pure. But despite how clear it was, there was still a lens, right? So there was still some medium via which he was experiencing the divine. It wasn't a pure, it wasn't. There was a subjective component there that was giving rise to it. So I think that dovetails very nicely that you quoted from the Piasetzna, that on the contrary, it's not that he had totally emptied himself from anything. On the contrary, because he was so strong in his own identity and his own strengths, what he brought to the table, so that's how the divine message that was supposed to flow through him, he did in fact succeed.
Yeah, I think this is an important point psychologically, because I think a lot of people that engage in spiritual literature believe that they need to eradicate the ego, get rid of the self.
So it's that eradication that when you ask me, what we can dismiss, I think that's what needs to be dismissed. Like the notion of eradication is what we're aiming for. Like there's some things that are just not meant to be there. Like they need to be like.
Oh, 1 second. I was just saying that to say the opposite.
Okay.
That sometimes there's an unhealthy attempt to eradicate the self. It might be helpful to distinguish like phenomenologically between I don't know whatever language you want to use, a false self and a true self, perhaps that we're looking to get rid of the false self, the external self, to embrace the true self, right? So it's the asplakaria. So Moses, as you said, looks through to use another expression there's looking through the lens darkly, right?
Yeah, to brush up on my New Testament.
There's looking through the glass darkly. So even though for him it's not glass darkly, there's still the glass that he's looking through, and each one has their own glass. But it seems that we cannot, and this is a point which is reminiscent of perhaps like a Kantian metaphysic, where we cannot eradicate our own lens. That will always be
nor should we want to.
Right. So perhaps telling people that they need to eradicate the self sounds like telling them they need to smash their lens.
Yeah.
That leaves them with no lens.
Yeah.
Instead, perhaps, maybe with this different language, which can be more subtle, which can sort of point to the need to affirm and embrace the true self, which is the divine self, while we're able to subdue the more bestial or selfish or the worst angels of our nature.
Okay, so
phrase that as a question.
I got it. Right, exactly. Phrase that as a question.
Yeah. So and I think this directly relates to our pantheism discussion, right? Where how do we reformulate the very first thing that I asked you to what we get rid of in theology, and you said we get rid of the subjectivity. How would we rephrase that with an appreciation of the inherent divinity within humanity, where we don't want to eradicate all of our subjectivity? So how would we rephrase that with that in mind?
So just to clarify that I understand your question, you're saying what would be the process via which we can use our subjectivity to be vehicles of the divine? Is that a
both? I mean, so there's both the internal process of connecting to that. It's also interesting the way you just phrase it, of vehicle of the divine. It's again externalizing the divine as something other to which we are a channel to, and I think that a notion of immanence.
Well, I'm intentionally referring to it as a distinct thing. Distinct doesn't mean an other. That's my Jungian side talking to me, right? So the idea that just because the thing is distinct doesn't mean that it's outside.
Right. So
it's an other.
You could have something distinct within.
So when I say a vehicle of the divine, I don't mean a vehicle of some other guy that's coming and hopping a ride on you. I mean, there's something going on in you that needs to be given expression, and you better figure out how to do it.
Right.
because either, in the best case scenario, you're missing out, and the worst case, it's going to,
And for those
come out in not good ways.
For those that are missing the reference here, the chariot or the vehicles of the divine is a Kabbalistic expression, which is the Merkava, which is
right. I mean, I guess I was kind of subliminally referring to that. Although, we could write on the idea. It's interesting. People are familiar with that term of the Merkava, this mystical idea, right? The first vision in Ezekiel where he sees this, complex, ornate, heavenly structure with different types of angels and all that, is typically referred to in rabbinic literature as Ma'aseh Merkava, like the description of the Merkava. Which, interestingly, that term is not actually in the text.
Yes.
The Merkava, the word Merkava, is not in the text at all.
Oh, wild.
Yeah, and this I was shown by a very special scholar who actually passed away a few years ago, Shaya Hadari of in the Old City. He pointed out that how did that expression come about? Like, where did that come from? So he said that in Chronicles, that term is used as an idiom for the Ark of the Covenant.
Interesting.
That's the Merkava.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And this, if you thought that was interesting, listen to this. There is a commandment, one of the, 613 commandments in the Torah, that the Ark requires poles to carry it, right? Everyone's seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark, how it looks, right? So it has to have
they can
poles.
never be removed.
And it's a prohibition, just like it's a prohibition to eat pork or to violate the Sabbath. It's a prohibition to remove the poles. So the question is, that makes sense for the 40 years that the Jews were wandering around in the desert.
Right.
But once it's in the Holy of Holies in the temple, hopefully for the long term, why does it need, what's the poles?
Why
it's
does it need
sitting there. Why does it need to have the poles forever?
Which are simply there for transportation.
Correct. Right. In order so that the Levites can carry it in the desert, ostensibly, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is that no, it might have served a practical function as well, but no, the structure of this Ark of the Covenant is that it is a vehicle. That's the whole idea. It's moving something. So the whole conception, and that's why it's even called, it's called by the Hebrews the Merkava, the chariot, even though it's not going anywhere. It's there, it's stationary. But it's called the Merkava.
Interesting.
Right? And this is why in classical rabbinical literature, right, the Midrash Rabbah, for instance, says about the forefathers, Ha'avot, Hein HaMerkava. They are the divine chariot. They are the chariot. So like the actual Ark of the Covenant, the gold box with the angels, so that is, the ultimate symbol of this phenomenon.
Yes. But
each person in their own way must figure out how to be a Merkava, how to also be a Merkava. Yeah?
Shammai, I have a feeling that you're peeking at my notes, because I wrote here...
Oh, absolutely not.
I wrote here, Hein.
So you would remember. Yeah. Sorry, I beat you to the punch.
No, but I think it's a really great point, and I think the point there is that they were able to nullify the parts of themselves which were extraneous to the parts of themselves which are essential, to use that term with all its metaphysical weight, to be chariots to that, to allow that will to be expressed, and the will of the all, the will of God.
I wouldn't even say nullify. I would say integrate. I would say
that's a better word.
Just because nullify implies that there's like some type of putting down. I think this is something. Just again going back to like the problem of jargon.
We're really switching seats here now.
Yeah, there's a very common term that's used a lot in mysticism and also in Hasidic thought about the idea of bitul, of nullification. And I think that upon examination, you'll see how this term does not actually mean nullification in the same way like we have in Jewish law, like something is batel, if cheese falls into your meat, you're not allowed to eat cheese and meat together. So if a very minuscule amount of cheese falls into your meat, so it's okay because it's batel, it's nullified. It's like it's not there, right? Yeah. So we don't mean it in that way. We mean it in that sense of that it doesn't perceive itself as a distinct entity outside of the broader context of all being.
Yes.
That's what batel means.
Yeah.
And everyone needs to be batel.
Yeah.
You better be batel. If you want to live in society, if you want to be a normal human being, you better be batel. In fact, if you can't be batel, that's probably the psychological definition of a psychopath. If you can't be batel, you can't. I am not capable of interacting with people. I don't care what he thinks, how she feels. I don't care. That's what psychopath is, right? So, but bitul, all it means is seeing yourself in the ultimate context of all being, right?
Yeah.
So that's bitul.
Yes,
and,
yes.
and bitul is necessary for integration.
Yes. I think this is language that I try to push for, and I'm so glad that you corrected me when I said nullified. It's actually funny because we're switching seats here a little because I was trying to correct you when you said to nullify
It's
subjectivity.
okay, you'll correct me.
No, it's really great.
You.
It's really
Yeah.
good. It's really healthy. So this, I think I'm right in my what's it called when you have a premonition that the conversation is going to get very much tied into this, which is fantastic. And we may have to have a separate conversation when we sit down. We talk about Maimonides and all the other pantheistic things that we discussed in the lead up to this conversation. But this notion of the Merkava, I want to make a point which I'm sure you'll agree with, which is that the fact that the Avot, the patriarchs and matriarchs, that they are the Hein Merkava, that they are this Merkava, which is such a brilliant way of deconstructing this notion from just being some sort of abstract spiritual concept to being a realized psychological concept and function, really. And the way that that's symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant is really profound. There's a really, I think there's a performative notion which we're doing now here. I don't know whose reading this was of the metaphor of the Ark of the Covenant having the poles inside of it represents the Ark being really the archetypal representation of the image of the Torah in much of Jewish literature, because it housed the Ten Commandments. According to some opinions, there's a very strong association between Torah and the Ark of the Covenant, and there's sort of two sides to that there. One of it is it's immutable, it's gold, it's set in stone, it's square, it doesn't change, it's perfect and everlasting. It's really, and yet it has poles, so it's ready to move at every moment. The Torah the Torah is both the eternal truth which never moves, never changes, and yet is always on the move, even when it's sitting. And I think the fact that we're having this conversation with the new poles, which are the technologies that we're using, we're sitting here with phones, we're using YouTube. I think what we're doing here is performative in taking the Torah and carrying its poles off into the internet. It's like the cyber poles of the Torah.
We touched a few times in this conversation about like the idea of like language. I think that this is the single biggest challenge in terms of having these conversations. Once you are stuck with the jargon, once you're stuck with the language, it's not possible to really progress. We need to frame these things in language that we can actually understand, whether that's conceptual language or just even the words themselves.
Yes.
It's mostly conceptual language. That's the key. That's the key problem. And I would say, and this is, we could also talk about this for hours, that all the milestones, so to speak, of the development of Jewish thought have been great successes in this of repackaging ideas in new conceptual frameworks that can bring the ideas forward.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to think about the interplay of here, the external and the internal, of the medium as the message, where the new language becomes new ideas. That the capacity to formulate new speech gives us the capacity to think new thoughts that are old thoughts. There's an interesting thought there. But in terms of the notion of the Kisei HaKavod and the vision of Ezekiel, you'll know the Talmud, which speaks about how
the throne of glory,
the throne of glory. Thank you.
Yeah.
Upon the throne of glory, there's the visage of there's a humanoid form. There's an Adam Shal Kisei. There's a man on the chair.
Yeah, it comes up a few times in Daniel as well.
And the Talmud comments that when this vision was revisioned by later Talmudic characters, or when it was interpreted hermeneutically by later Talmudic characters, they interpreted it as a man in their own image. So who is it that sees the Adam Shal Kisei, this human on the throne, as a Ish Kfarim? He sees it as a man of the village, and that one sees it as a rural man. Basically, each of them projecting their own image. Are you familiar with this Gemara?
Right. So there's, as far as I know, at least in the Babylonian Talmud, there's two passages that are similar to this. One is what you're referring to. What is this man? Like, who is the man on the throne? And the other one is a statement in Tractate Sanhedrin about the identity of the Messiah, because there's a few verses scattered mostly in Isaiah, but in other places as well, that seem to allude that the Messiah has a specific name. Like, the name of the Messiah is a big deal. Mm-hmm. So you have these Talmudic rabbis discussing the name of the Messiah. So Rav Sheila comes up and he says his name is Shalva. Rav Sheila says Shalva, and Rav Chizkiah says his name is Chizkiyahu. It's like it's almost like a parody. It's almost like a joke. Like they're all like just giving their own, right? So there's a comment made by Maharal of Prague, Yehuda Lowy of Prague, 500 years ago. Is not wrong.
Yeah.
Long time. So he has in one of his books, Netzach Yisrael, talking about the nature of redemption at the personal and national level. He says that this is far from a joke. These scholars are identifying where the Messianic consciousness is in them.
That's brilliant.
That's what they're doing. Meaning, whatever is meant to be experienced at a global level by that redemptive episode that we call the Messiah, how does that manifest at the individual level in me?
Yeah.
And like that was that practice.
Yeah.
So similarly, when you talk about the man on the throne, it's very important to say, like, just like we said about the Ark of the Covenant, like there's the Ark, there's the Merkava, there's the, chariot, the divine chariot, and each individual person is their own chariot. So similarly, there's the man on the throne, right? There's the image, so sometimes referred to in the Kabbalistic jargon as the Adam Kadmon, like the primal original man.
Yeah.
Right? Also, Jung is we were talking about Jung before. This is like a very big idea in Jung of like the original man is, we're all trying to find the versions of that. Like we're all trying to figure out what that looks like here. Like however it looks like there is nice, but trying to figure out how it expresses itself here.
Right.
So that archetypical concept, which is again, shochen ad. We started off with this. It's fundamentally detached and removed and transcendent. That's what I was looking for, right? How does that find its expression here?
Yeah.
And again, far from being a warning to distance oneself, the very fact that symbol exists is an invitation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's dangerous because you could say, oh, well, like the man is me, right? You look at the man and you see yourself, right? This is going back to the Aspaklara thing. I just remembered this when we were talking about the idea of the lenses, right? You experience the divine through a lens. So, Rav Tzadok of Lublin, who, I believe he died in 1900, right? Relatively recent, Hasidic thinker, very interesting because he didn't come from the Hasidic world. He has very interesting contributions to the world of Hasidic thought. He says, what happens when you look through a lens that isn't clear, like completely muddled, completely dirty? You see yourself.
You see your reflection. Yeah.
So there's a risk, meaning on the one hand, you're supposed to look through the lens. You're supposed to engage with the divine through your subjectivity. But if there's too much subjectivity there, then all you see is yourself. Right, you make yourself a god, to use the terms that are often thrown around. Right, you make yourself a god by emphasizing that subjective element too much. You look at the man on the throne and you see yourself.
Okay, so here's the question. Firstly, just to throw in a bit of a language modification, something which I try to stay conscious of. I think although Adam is often used in the masculine, sometimes it's all inclusive, and it might be more helpful and more inclusive to speak about the human instead of the man.
I'll take the opportunity to clarify. The very first time that term is introduced in Genesis, it makes it very clear that Adam is not a masculine term at all.
It's a conglomerate of masculine
and feminine. It says that God created Adam, Zachar v'Nekeva, male and female, right? So typically, commonly, obviously, Adam is used in the masculine term, but in its technical definition, Adam is neither masculine
or both, actually.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Which is also a very strong Jungian concept of this coincidentally opposite term of the masculine and feminine, which has strong Kabbalistic roots. 100%. So with that in mind, this notion of the danger of obfuscating the transcendent with our own reflection, let me follow in through that. When we speak about the Avot, when we speak about the patriarchs who are the Merkava, there's a phrase in the Talmud where it says that every single person in all generations is obligated to ask themselves, when will my own actions parallel those of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob?
Yeah.
Sarah, Rachel, and Leah. The notion that we are demanded upon ourselves to judge ourselves by the barometer of these people that we're identifying as the divine chariot is, I think, a very empowering, challenging, and an important one, because it doesn't allow us to deify those characters away from our potentiality, which I think sometimes happens in Christian theology, perhaps, where there's likewise an incarnational theology, where there's a human that's made divine, but it's only him, and we can never reach that. It again becomes pushed over the edge of transcendence and inaccessibility. And I think the fact that we have these manifestations incarnations, chariots of the divine in Jewish theology, but they remain characters that are human still, that we're challenged to be like them, I think is an important point here. And this leads to my question, which is, how do we know when we're looking at the lens, whether we're seeing through it or we're seeing back to it, particularly because, according to Genesis, famously, man is created in the image of God. So I hope people aren't going to get stuck in the literalistic language here. None of us believe that God has a human face with a nose and a mouth, but phenomenologically, experientially, on a existential level, the divine expresses itself in a humanoid structure, at least some aspect of the divine, which is the part that we can relate to and see. How then can we distinguish internally when we're looking through our own phenomenological lenses, whether we're seeing the divine face or our own face, or does that distinction is there a need for, you said there is a need for that distinction?
Yes, absolutely.
So how do we navigate that space on a personal,
very vital to maintain.
And I think this is an important personal question, right? How do we know that when our own desires are arising within us, is this a divine or is this selfish? Is this for the all? Is this for the all or is this for the animal? How do we do that?
So first of all, I'll say right off the bat, I'm thinking which direction to take with this question, because it's quite multifaceted. You can go and here. Let's start off with this. There's a statement in the Talmud. There's a statement in the Talmud in Tractate Gittin that says, "In Adam omed al divrei Torah elim kein nechshal b'hen." No one succeeds in matters of wisdom unless he has faltered in them. And it quotes a verse from the beginning of Isaiah, that this stumbling block, referring to the code of Jewish law, divine wisdom, the Torah, it's calling it a stumbling block. Now, in context, you could say that it's referring to some communal problem that it's talking about over there in Isaiah. But the point is that it's a very strange terminology to use for the collective wisdom of the nation. Is called the stumbling block, right? So says the Talmud, that is the nature of the Torah. That's the name for it. It's the stumbling block.
Explain.
That's not particularly, right? That's a little disconcerting. Yes, right? You're handing me this thing that's just supposed to be like, the Torah myth, right? Like the divine truth, right? The Orach Chaim, the path of life, and you're calling it the stumbling block. Because that is the very nature of it, right? There is a trial and error element here, which is unavoidable, right? The Talmud lists that there are, a few choice individuals who never once sinned, and even those people, it should be noted that, first of all, I don't think anyone would consider that those particular individuals were at the zenith of a Jewish, I don't think they made the biggest contributions. And B, I don't know if we would consider every action that they made not a mistake, meaning, they might have made mistakes. It just could have been that they did it so innocently that it wasn't considered a sin, right? So the idea, there is no way to avoid the trial and error element. I think that should just be put on the table. The next step in that line of thought is that for sure something that is required in order to do this work is maintaining that element of bitul, like we talked about before, right? Like Moses is extolled for his virtue of humility. Right. Again, the element of bitul, of nullification, of being prepared to integrate, of not viewing yourself, of having that consciousness inculcated deeply that you are not the end all be all. It doesn't matter how high you get, you are not the end all be all.
Doesn't matter what your mother thinks of you.
Right. I mean, no, it's great to hear praise from your mother that keeps you moving forward. But to know that in essence you are not the end all be all, and to have that ingrained deeply in our awareness, I think is central. That's number two. Number three, I think it's always good to start from the ground level when we're trying to answer these questions. And we're talking about how the forefathers, these ancient biblical characters, they are the archetypes embodying these divine attributes. And as we quoted before, Hein Hein HaMerkava, they are the divine chariot, each one in their own way. What is the nature of the narratives that we find in the Bible? What are these narratives? So we think someone's recording the history of how Abraham's life went about and how Isaac's life went about, but you have to take a step back and understand that that's not true at all. Meaning, the books of the Bible were written by prophets, right? The Torah was written by Moses. Okay, so Moses, hundreds of years after Abram has already passed away, he's been given instruction what to write down. So when you think of that, if there was half a chapter on each year of Abraham's life, then the narrative would be exponentially longer than it is. Meaning, what we have of Abraham's life are choice frames of narratives, right? And that's being delivered for a specific reason, and the reason is that we are being shown what is the path of progression of someone who is embodying this truth. That is what's being told, right? It's Torah, meaning it's instruction. Also, the stories are instruction. Right? So yes, there are important historical details that are thrown in there, and the history and of events, of things that happened or didn't happen is important. But in terms of the underlying message, it's like these are the elements of the narrative that are showing you what is the process. And as we all know, just a cursory reading of the Bible shows you that it's not all peaches and cream. That's not the journey. The journey is, again, the stumbling, the correction, the realizing the mistake, the altering. All of this is part of it, and that's why we have that. So if a person wants to know, how do I know when my subjectivity is getting the best of me, and when do I need to be more subservient, when I need to focus more on the beetle side of the more self-nullification side. A, it's all trial and error. There's no textbook answer. And B, that this is the reason that we have these stories to begin with, to understand that when someone is on the journey of achieving that level of becoming a Merkava, we have these stories to use as examples of how these people falter, of how the very qualities that they're meant to give expression to are often the sources of tremendous error. And to use that as an example. This is the mandate. This is what's being given, right? These are the stories that we need to use as... Yeah.
I think on that line it's particularly telling that, as you say, that even the characters that are supposedly sinless from the Talmud's perspective aren't the people who make the greatest splash in Jewish history. And it's the flaws of the characters which the Bible is so often reiterating and repeating, because I think that with this drive that really begins in the Bible and continues throughout Jewish mysticism of this need to emulate the divine, right? V'halachta b'drachav, to literally follow in the way of God, to be divine, imitato die in the Latin. If we're on a quest for self-divinization, for the apotheosis of the individual, it can so easily lead to megalomania and to narcissism and to crazy things. Who was the sage that it was reported that he carried two papers in each pocket.
The Kutzker, no?
It was the Kutzker b'shvili nevar olam, that the world is created for me, which is the phrase from the Talmud. And the other pocket he carried vanoichi offer ve'efer, and I am but dust and ashes.
I'm pretty sure it was the Hasidic master. The Kutzker.
So this need to balance both. That there's a really deep, almost divine egoism that runs through Talmudic, biblical, and rabbinic literature of who Hillel says, "Imanikan akol kan," if I'm here, all is here. Bishvili nevar olam, the world is created for me. Yaakov is Be'er Olam, as Jacob creates worlds. The tzaddik is the one who God commands, and the tzaddik nullifies.
Tzaddik Moshe B'Yirath Elohim. Yeah, that's a quote from the book of Samuel.
Kodesh Baruch Mekayim v'tzaddik gozer, and tzaddik gozer v'Kodesh Baruch Mekayim. There's a very strong divine notion imputed to the human, and that's an achievable divinity. It seems it's not just one which is for the tzaddik who is categorically distinct from the human. There is a humanity there because they fail too and they fall. It's the tzaddik who is sheva yibol tzaddik kam, the tzaddik who falls 7 times and gets back up again. So balancing that with the deep humility of this is not about me as I conceptualize myself as separate from the rest of reality, which is, I think, the fundamental flaw. That vanoichi offer ve'efer, that I'm truly dust and ashes, and only in my dust and ashes can I really rise up like the divine phoenix, to be reborn in that divine space. That necessity for the death of false self to be reintegrated to the divine self, I think is an important theme. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on this notion of the strive towards divinity. I was recently, I had a group we were learning together, Tomer Devera from Ramesh Devera, who really outlines the ethical process of the human becoming divine. This theme, I think, has a lot to do with pantheism, even though pantheism is generally more externalized in its discussion. It's more a metaphysical or an ontological discussion. I think there's a psychological discussion, which is the discussion we're having here about pantheism. How do you see that the internal pantheistic drive being expressed in your conception of Judaism?
The internal pantheistic drive, like that emerges from the individual psyche? Is that
the Jewish mandate upon the internal necessity to be deified, to be like God, or to be God. How do you navigate that, and where perhaps does that blur the line between the human and the divine in a way that would make what you said before uncomfortable, or does that work with that model?
It's an interesting question. I've never thought of it quite that way. I'll start answering if you feel like it's not addressing what you just asked. You can stop me. There's what's coming to mind is a quote from the Midrash Rabbah in Leviticus that says, has there ever been a man who has put the tzitzit, the fringes, on his garment without me first giving him a garment? And it proceeds to list all these different mitzvot, all these different divine commandments that require different dimensions of human experience in order to accomplish them. All of these things are possible because I brought you into them and gave you and introduced. I threw you into this context. So this is what you do in this context. And it's interesting because, like,
for those that don't know what it's this is what we're
it's fine. And I'm realizing this is that particular mitzvah is actually a very, very good example, a very appropriate example, also from the perspective of the technicalities of Jewish law. There is no imperative. This might come as a shock to people, but there is no imperative to actually wear this garment.
Right.
To go out and get one. There's no such thing. There's no such imperative.
Right.
If a person is going to wear such a garment, then he has to put fringes on it.
It's an if-then clause.
Correct. Now, obviously, people go out of their way in order to find such a garment so that they'll have the opportunity to fulfill the commandment. So that's obviously a legitimate thing. It's praiseworthy for sure. But the technical context, I think, gives some perspective of what I'm trying to bring about. You are thrown into a context. You are put into a context by the very fact of your birth, right? Another quote from Tractate Avot. You are born against your will. Like you're put into the situation. You didn't choose to, right? You're put into these contexts, and the full array of contexts in the inner and outer world, our own personal situation, our family dynamics, our community, the time of history, right? To quote Stevie Wonder, God knew exactly where you ought to be placed. I'm butchering the lines, just something like that, right? So all this vast array of interconnected contexts that we're put into, and we're told the mitzvot, the commandments of the Torah, are essentially how to relate from a divine consciousness to the full array of contexts in which we find ourselves. That's, I think, a very good working definition of what a mitzvah is. Yeah, and that coming from that perspective requires a lot of self-awareness. Meaning, you have to realize, I'm in a particular context right now. Like I'm in a certain context, and then the question is, once you identify that you're in that context, how do I use that to have divinity flow through it? It sounds very abstract, and maybe I'll try to bring it down with it, like a specific example. A person finds himself in a certain social interaction, social setting. Any interaction with other people. So they have to, it requires a certain amount of self-awareness just to know that the dynamics of what's going on. Are we in a social gathering? Are we a more solemn context? Are we happy? Are we sad? Like what's actually going on? That's question number one. And once the person arrives at a good answer to that question, then they can start thinking about how to properly permeate that context with divinity. And I think that's essentially the whole task of Jewish law, of figuring out how are we going to permeate this context with divinity, right? All right. Sixth quote from Tractate Avot. a person who
can give us the Hebrew and English as well.
A table. I'll just skip to the English. Right. A table that words of wisdom were not set upon it, as if a person is eating filth and waste. Which means that when you are gathered together with other people eating, and you are having that interaction of communion, of eating food and sitting together, which is very deep, not just in the Jewish tradition, but in all traditions, like the act of just sitting down, like here, like we relate to the act of eating in such a, we can go on about this, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but like the act of eating, sitting at a table, we relate to it as like such a, like you're hungry, you need to eat, so you sit down, you eat something, go back to whatever you're doing, but the idea of how there's like a significance of you're sitting down, you're giving nourishment to your body, you're sitting with other people as you're doing that, and there's like a relationship going on. That very idea is very foreign, I think, to modern men. The idea of a zimun, right? That we make the grace after meals collectively together with everyone, like that very idea also encapsulates this theme. But anyway, not to focus too much on that.
Yeah, that's great.
But
Just eating as an act of communion of
eating as act of communion. So says the Mishnah and Avot. If a person finds himself in that context and doesn't take the opportunity to share a thought, an idea, an epiphany, an insight, something that you had about like the nature, something important that imbues life with meaning. If you did not seize upon that opportunity, then what did you just do? Like what's the difference between what you just did now and a cow grazing in a field? There is no difference. In fact, it's worse because you're consciously in a way like rejecting that, whereas the cow is just going about its business. Yeah. So it's So just trying to answer your question as concisely as possible. Identifying context and knowing how to imbue it, and this is why we put such a strong emphasis. I'll say this might not be directly related to your question, but I think it's necessary to bring up. This is why Jewish tradition focuses so strongly on Torah study, about how Torah study is so central to the religious experience, because as the Talmud says in Tractate Kiddushin, that the study leads to action. HaTorah mevi lidei ma'aseh. That's what characterizes the study. That through the study, the person knows what to do. Right? We have this idea that some people might be familiar with this term, which is really like a pejorative. It's the closest thing to like an insult that the rabbis invented, called an am ha'aretz, which literally means a person of the land. But what it means is someone who's just totally ignorant. He's out of the loop. He's cut off, unhinged. Also in modern Israeli jargon, it's used to describe someone like that.
Unlettered.
So what is the definition of an amaretz? Like what, like you're going to give me a one-line definition. So someone might say, someone who doesn't, know how to learn a page of Talmud. Like, I don't think that's a good definition. The best definition I saw was from the medieval Israeli commentator on the Mishnah, Ovadia Bartanura, who lived here in the 1300s. He says, an amaretz is someone who wants to do good and has no idea how.
That's
an amaretz.
That's painful.
And that's why the rabbis considered this person not only like, lowly, but also dangerous in a way. So I think it's a slightly different discussion about like, the dangers of it. But the point is that the amaretz wants to do something. He wants to, but he has no idea how.
That's very
so he's unlearned. He's unlearned that he doesn't know what to do.
That's very fascinating, and it's also something which is relatable. I think there are many moments in life when we feel like an amaretz, we feel hopeless
100%.
With the situation. We'd love to know what we can do to, whether it's interpersonal or global. I think it's a very relatable phenomenon.
It's the study. It's making study central. This is why study is so central. It's like obviously it's a cliche about how learning is so central to the Jewish experience, but this is why. This is why. Because if the whole point is to figure out how to imbue the phenomenon with divinity, it requires knowledge. It requires receiving from people who are experienced, people who have thought about this for a long time, practicing it. Yeah.
I love the idea inherent there as well that the individual, even the am ha'aretz, wants to do good. The question is just, do they have the capacity to make that desire actionable? And that's what learning is. Here are the two follow-up questions. One, which is coming from more of a humanistic place, and one more technical. The humanistic question, and what we just mentioned about those that sit, the Mishnah that you quoted from Avot, those that sit in a table and don't speak words of meaning, I like actually how you phrase it, words of meaning. It's as if they're eating zivchei mitim is the original. They're like, which is an obscure reference, but it's not a good reference. The humanistic side of me wants to say, isn't it enough that humans are sitting together in an act of communion, as you said, which is a profound moment of breaking bread, a profound moment of sharing their vulnerability. There's a lot that happens when we eat, which we ignore in modern society to our detriment, without needing to bring in a religious component or even a meaning component. If they were present enough in their act of eating, this may sound a bit like paganistic, but would that not be enough in some sense? It almost seems like we're disparaging that experience by saying that you also need to throw on top of that a Dvar Torah, like some words of inspiration, or like.
No, I hear what you're saying. The short answer is no, it's not enough, and I want to say why. And I think that the answer is important. It's tricky because you bring up a very, very valid point with talking about how, should we not just suffice with recognizing the meaning at that more simplistic layer. So I don't want to dispense with that. I don't want to negate with that, and I'm gonna try to loop back around to that.
We're at the human layer.
Yeah, but so the reason why it's not enough is because things must be made explicit in order to have their full essence. There's an idea. I think this is mostly developed by the medieval Jewish philosophers, of the idea of yotzei ala poal. Something is me'akoach ala poal. Something is in strength, i.e., potentiality, is brought into poal, action, full expression. The rabbis refer to this, by the way, at least on the human level, when they refer to it as a golem. The idea of a golem has been mythologized and made famous, like this idea of like this monster type person. But what that means is a golem versus a human being means that a person without any form, meaning an undeveloped human being, someone who has not been cultured, not been taught, no education, no nothing. He's just a golem. In fact,
just matter, no form.
Right. In modern Hebrew, in fact, we use the word golem to describe some raw material, right? Like, gomi means something that has not yet been developed.
Like a chunk of clay.
Like a chunk of clay, exactly. So the thing needs to be brought into expression in order, it shouldn't sit in its golem state. Not that it isn't there, but it can't sit in its golem state. And that's why it needs to be brought into expression. We see that, in fact, the Bible makes this explicit. The very first act of man was not eating the apple or whatever it was, pineapple or from the tree, but rather the very first act that the very first instruction he was given was to give names to the elements of creation. And to give a name to something isn't just like a verbal label, like it'll be easier to categorize all the stuff, right? It's easier to distinguish between the giraffe and the hyena because they have different names. But it's not the idea of giving something a name is saying like there's something that's being called forth by being itself to this thing. And that's the giraffe-ness of the giraffe. It's being called forth. And indeed, the giraffe interacts with the creation. There's an interplay. There's a relationship there. That's the idea of koreh shem, that something is called out. You're called to. Right? Prophecy is described as this experience. Like Kra, God called out. He calls out to the prophet, like to speak. Right? So that's why it's not enough to just settle. And not that meditation and quiet contemplation does not have its place. I'm not saying that like everything has to be speaking all the time. That's not what I'm trying to imply. I'm saying that there is a side of divine service, of divine practice, which is bringing it into expression, and part of that practice in this context specifically is making the thing explicit. And that's why the rabbis say it's not enough just to think about it or be present. It also has to be spoken out. Now, I want to circle back to what you said because there's a huge caveat to all of this, and you bring up a very, very important point, and thank you for bringing it up. You asked, like the way that you phrased it, is it not enough just to be present with the communion, with the human, bonds that are clearly there? I'm not right. That's clearly a thing that's going on. Is that not enough? So I said it's not enough. However, that's not to say that it isn't there and it shouldn't be recognized. In fact, I would say that on a certain level, that's like the first step. In fact, this is what I was trying to allude to before when we were talking about how Jewish law relates to the act of Suda. Like we know that there's a whole category of Jewish law called B'tziat HaPat, right? The laws pertaining to breaking bread. Like it's a whole category of Jewish law. Like all these different practices involved with eating. So I think that those rituals are arcane at best. If you don't actually know what's going on, if you don't have that awareness, if you don't have that initial awareness, then all this stuff doesn't have any meaning, which goes back to what we were saying before about the first step is identifying the context, and the next step is figuring out how to imbue the context with divinity. It's like it's a two-pronged thing. So yes, the recognizing the and I think that and I sense this, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I sense in the way that you were phrasing this as a little bit of a critique on like this, religious model of, oh yeah, you have to say a Dvar Torah, like you have to say like, a speech in order to make the meal legitimate. Why can't we just be like, all happy that we're sitting here together, right? So this is a critique, and it's a fair critique, and the critique is something like, you are ritualizing everything in these like weird practices when like, what's just happened to being with the experience and just like being one with whatever it is that we're doing, right? Because they perceive the religious ritual side as negating that. Where it's not negating, on the contrary, it's not negating, it's building off of it. It's recognizing what's going on. What is going on? We're all sitting here, we're communing together, we are in a relationship here. That is what's going on. And now that we've recognized that there's a relationship going on, what are we going to do about it? This is what we should do. We should ride this wave, because it is a wave. We should ride the wave, right? Yeah,
I think that's really beautifully said. I love that notion of this is a very uniquely Jewish mystical idea, and I'm saying that coming from a background of like an interesting comparative mysticism, where language is typically seen as the devil, the enemy, that which causes bifurcation and separation. That silence is what must be found to find divinity, which is the space of that in Judaism too.
Oh yeah,
certainly.
100%.
But the notion that language is essential and language is constructive and language is divine, language is that which with God creates the world. Ba'asar ma'amarat, to quote again Mishneh Avot.
Yeah.
It's getting like the top citations here. Yeah. That God in Genesis creates the world with speech, and humans, through our capacity to articulate reality, we are framing and constructing the narratives that shape our reality, and even so, I maybe want to follow this up with a compromised question, which is, let's say people are sitting around. Is it enough? Do you think it's enough to articulate the communion that is taking place within that sitting? And does that count as Divrei Torah?
It's almost like a joke, because very often, people who are, people find themselves like, they're sitting at the table, they're rushing to eat because they got to get back to whatever it is that they were doing, in yeshiva, the guys, they have no time to eat, they're learning all day. They're going to grab a piece of bread, eat and get away, but they want to, fulfill their obligation of saying words of Torah. So what do? They sit down and they say, it's a law that you have to say words of Torah at the table, and then they
quote
get
the
up. They quote right, exactly. They quote this imperative as fulfilling their. So it's like a joke almost, but I think 100%. I think that if the whole point is just just that it could be articulated and brought to full expression and be clear, then it doesn't really matter what you say.
That's an interesting idea. It's not something which I really share a lot, but I worked in the past with, there's an organization called Friendship Circle, you're probably aware, where it pairs up the kids in society that are categorized as normal and kids that are characterized as special needs. Pairs them up to have like these friendship buddies. They get together once a week, twice a week, whatever it is. And it's generally done in the house of the special needs child to give the parents, a reprieve, and to also allow the children to have friendship. And I think that as important as it is for special needs children, it's also really a beautiful experience, an important experience. I mean, I learned a lot as what society labels a normal child to have that kind of relationship. And one thing which was very fascinating, we had a group session once. We all went to the aquarium together, and it was like a very big trip, and like there was a lot of kids on autistic spectrums and a lot of like some more extreme. And we had a child psychologist come in, and we were also quite young, like we're teenagers, so we're not like trained to deal with like special needs children in public spaces. It's like, it's all very complex.
Which makes it more organic also, I'm sure. It's not like a
it's not contrived
clinical
it's an incredible, it's like a crazy thing that's done in it, but it's really beautiful in many ways. And anyhow, so the child psychologist told me something when I was 15 or 16, I still remember till today, that many people that are diagnosed with autism, they have a tough time, and I think there's something about this in the human experience. They just perhaps experience the further extremes of that spectrum of the human condition in that peak and valley, where they have a hard time actually relating to the experience which they're experiencing in the present. So I'm no psychologist, and this could be totally hot nonsense, but the point I'm trying to make is a real point, regardless. That the child, let's say, can see the shock through the glass, and they know that this is like an incredible thing to see. They can know that conceptually, but they won't be able to feel that excitement. And we were told, as the children accompanying them, to say to them, isn't this so cool that we're watching a shark? Like to articulate the excitement,
right.
To really bring it out.
That's a very apt. It's a very, very apt parable, I guess. Yeah. That's really insightful.
I think about this all the time. I think about this all the time in conversation, as someone who tries to develop their skills as a conversationalist, which is another art. I think like breaking to eat bread, sitting down in conversation is also an act of communion, definitely. And sometimes, just
in light of what you're saying, I'm sorry to cut you off.
No,
basically, what we're saying is that because I framed it before that the ritual is building off of that base level human experience. But in a way, it could be even a preamble, meaning it is a device to bring that actually brings to the fore.
Yes.
What's going on.
Yes. Certainly. Yeah.
So it's kind of like a pre and a post in that way.
That it both creates the capacity for
both it creates the capacity to be aware, and once you're aware, it also brings it out, brings it to its fullest,
to some meta consciousness.
To its fullest mode of expression.
So I think that's interesting. I think in conversation, and in a conversation, there's like multiple things happening. There's like multiple things going on, right? You're like thinking about like the lighting and the recording, and is everything being caught, and how is it looking, and how am I coming across, and what's my follow up going to be, and then you're also trying to be listening, be present. There's like there's so many things going on simultaneously, which is fascinating. But I think also part of what I'm learning is that there's necessity to highlight the beauty of a moment or a concept as it gets brought out, and it's not enough just to have an exchange on a level of profundity if the profundity itself is not being made explicit by being articulated. And I think part of the way that part of the response to each other of saying like that point was a really great conceptualization of this concept, and that brought out something for me. That there's sort of this mutual disclosure of articulating what's emerging in this moment through which is being created through speech.
Yeah, I feel compelled to like encapsulate this in a particular Jewish practice, just because it's important. I think to make this as concrete as possible. I think that the practice that we have of brachot, of making blessings on things, encapsulates this in the most potent way possible. We have we have blessings that we make on an array of phenomena. One category is birkot hane'anim, which literally means blessings on pleasure, right? On eating, right? Eating is the most common, but also on smelling things, right? For instance, there's birkot hariyah, when you see something unique, right? If you see the ocean, you haven't seen the ocean for a certain amount of time. You see some other natural phenomena. The bracha is simply a declaration, right? A lot of people get confused very often. They say, blessed are you, God. It's kind of like it's almost like it's a cliche that's lost its meaning because it's said so many times, but it actually does mean something. Baruch atah, blessed are you. It's giving recognition that you, God, are the thing that gave rise to this thing. Baruch atah means you, God, are the source of this thing. The idea of Baruch, again, not to get too into the technicalities, but the word Baruch means the expansion or flow from. We even say when you're describing like a stream of water, like a brecha is a flowing stream of water. So when we say Baruch atah, that you are the ultimate source of this expansive coming into being. So you say, so all blessings start off with that formulation, Baruch atah, you are the source of blessing, and then you make a specific reference to whatever it is that's going on, right? Borei pri ha'etz, you are the creator of this fruit, right? Osem ma'aseh bereshit, you are the one that brought this natural phenomenon into being that I'm experiencing right now. So it's simply a declaration that's honing in the most direct way possible. It's like this experience now is that. So you might say, well, I'm seeing the ocean, I'm in awe of the ocean. It's like, why is it not enough to just be in awe of the ocean? Why do I have to make a damn blessing? Like, why do I have to say this specific formulation? So on the contrary, like you really want to get the full experience of whatever it is that's welling up inside of you. This is what you say. Like this is how you express it, right?
Yeah.
The poets, like essentially, this is what poets are trying to do. They're trying to figure out how to make it articulate. Why do they need to do that? Why don't they just sit with the experience? Because it's not enough to sit with the experience. There's a need, right? That the fundamental primordial need of man is to call out, to give it a name, Right? I mean to give it a name. Again, not a verbal label, but to give it an expression, to give it something, and it's made more. And it's given its full expression only with that. So whether the articulation is verbal or the articulation is action, the different modes of articulation, all these things are right. In the last chapter of Psalms, it says right, Hallelu benevel dechinur, you will to give praise with with instruments. Hallelu betof umachol, or to praise him with dance, meaning that. The mouth, the musical instruments, the dance, it's all modes of articulation. Yeah. People who dance know this. Yes. It's just another language. It's not like, So it's the articulation. It's the making explicit. It's the calling out the name. Yes. Is what we're aiming for.
I think that's a really powerful notion. I think the challenge which you're well aware of is that in the attempts to place this mandate upon us to declare the awesomeness, the emergence, the divinity of the ordinary, really, of the rainbow, of the ocean, of a sip of water, of the ability to successfully execute one's bathroom needs, things that are miraculous in nature, and we part of the necessity for the declaration is to not take those things for granted. I think the religious challenge is that how do we then not take the blessing for granted, and this for anyone that's grown up religious, anyone that's grown up Jewish in this particular context knows that those declarations become so rote that they lose their capacity to inspire the awe which they're intended to inspire within us. Do you have any like tip or trick to I have one, but I'm curious to know if you have a way to counteract that natural sort of malaise and.
Well, I think it's an intractable problem. I mean, the prophets, 3,000 years ago were already talking about mitzvat anashim melumada, that the practice is just becoming rote. And this is before blessings were even enacted. This is pre-blessings. This is right. This is when a lot of the ritual that we know of, at least the rabbinic literature, was not yet formulated, at least in its form. I mean, it had obviously expression. There were blessings before that. I'm saying all the formalization that we're familiar with today didn't even exist, and they were complaining about that then. So I think it's an intractable problem. I think that there's no solution. However, it's worth, once you're aware that the goal is this, to achieve it, meaning there is a goal beyond the specific rote, that certainly helps.
Right, you set your vision in the right place.
Right, exactly. To know that there, like, you are trying to accomplish something with this. Yeah.
I had an interesting experiment. There's a short version of.
Wait, I am interested in hearing your tip. Is this your tip? Okay,
wait, did I cut you off from saying something?
No, I'm done. Yeah. I just hoped that you were going to tell me your tip.
This is my tip. I don't know if it's a tip. It's an experimentation which I did. I've been a fan of Zalman Schachter Shalom. Yeah. He talks about making Judaism empirical or experiential, where you can sort of do experiments with your relationships with God, and it's a very interesting thing to play with. So particularly in prayer and other areas, he focuses on. What I tried was, so as you know, after we eat, there's different, depending on what we eat, there's different forms of blessings. There's a short form, there's a long form blessing, essentially. And the short form blessing is actually very poetic and very rich in symbolism and in allusion, very, very, very poetically significant. But it's something which I found myself doing out of rote and not paying attention to the poetry, which, as you said so wonderfully, is the intention of all poetry is to call us into the grandeur of the moment, and that becomes lost in us. So what I did was, I went online and I found in English, sort of just a random ecumenical, not specific to any religion, grace after meal, and it rhymes. It goes like this: we give you thanks for food and drink and all that you provide, mountains, flowers, stars above, and family by our side. We ask that we may hear your voice and always be our guide from now until the end of times. May we in you abide. Amen. It's like pretty non-denominational, pretty clean. Like, it comes out of Christianity and you can hear the echoes of that. But I started saying that, and I didn't know it by heart when I started. So I would have to pull out my phone.
Oh, you have to
have to look at the words. I have to be conscious. And it made me think about it. Like we give you things. There's a presence here
100%.
For food and drink, for family, for mountains and stars, and all. I really thought about the words.
Yeah.
What happened was, very quickly, as soon as I committed it to memory, it became rap, and now I sit and I ramble it off, and it's become there's almost a necessity to keep reinventing our own prayers, our own declarations, our own signposts. That every time we bump into them, we see them afresh. And that was an interesting. It was a failed experiment because that itself became route. Yeah, so that's about as far as
right.
I go.
I think, yeah, it's actually very insightful what you just said. I appreciate you bringing this up. I didn't think of this, but I think that the very fact that there is a repetitive nature to these things, like you talked about we were talking about the Ark of the Covenant before. Like on the one end, it's like this immutable thing. On the one end, it needs to move. Mm-hmm. So like the immutability and the openness to change has to like somehow those two things have to coexist somehow. And that's a very insightful point. When it comes to liturgy specifically, this is already an assertion regarding like technicalities of Jewish law. But I think that it's very, very clear from the Talmud itself that people used to ad lib all the time in prayer. Mm-hmm. And this might come off like slightly controversial to people. I'm fully aware of that. People want to look it up. One source that comes to mind is in Tractate Brachot on 38b. If they want to go look it up, and you don't have to take my word for it. But it said there were two incidents back to back in the same study hall. And one day, the leader of the prayers got up and he prayed a very short prayer. And the students complained to their teacher, why is he being so short? Why is he being so terse? Mm-hmm. So the teacher said, no, don't worry. Sometimes it's good to be short. As Moses prayed for his sister when his sister Miriam became sick, right? El Narafan Allah, right? God, please heal her. So, that was, just those three words. Right. And then the following day, they had the opposite experience. The guy, the leader of the prayers was taking long. He went. He was taking his time. He was taking his time, but not just taking his time. The actual prayers were long. He was saying a lot. Yes. So again, the students complained. I'm not sure it was the same students who complained. The students
sound like they cannot be satisfied.
Well, right. I don't think it was the same students, but whatever. The point is they complained. And the master said, no, sometimes it's worth being lengthy, as Moses prayed for 40 days straight, as it says, right, in the end of Exodus, to attain the forgiveness of the Jewish people after the golden calf. 40 days straight he prayed. 40 days straight. What is it saying? It's saying that there is a structure, 100%. In fact, the context of that statement in the Talmud is talking about the enactment from the earliest rabbinic sages, the men of the Great Assembly, right? That there's a certain structure of prayer, right? The Amidah prayer that has 18 specific blessings. People are probably familiar with it. But within those blessings, person could make their own thing. In fact, should probably make their own thing. So in light of what you're saying, it's like I think just practically speaking, it's very important. Like to work within that framework because the framework is very important. It's like it's the squareness of the arc. But on the other hand, to have that contribution, which is a bulwark against rote.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And there's as you're alluding to, there is actually a point. I mean, what we're saying now is applicable directly to people that are practicing Jewish paths of spirituality and closeness to God. But I think this is really applicable to
I think this is a universal thing that if you have a practice, it will, after enough repetition, will become rote.
This is human. This is not Jewish.
No, it's not Jewish at all.
But I think that in the Jewish context, there is space in, as you well know, in the Shema Kolenu prayer, where there's actually space given at the end of the recitation of the official prayer before the blessing.
So it's actually a common misconception. That thing that this imperative that you're talking about now, that in the Shema Kolenu blessing, you add your own supplications. That applies to all the blessings.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, a lot of people don't know that.
How did it get specifically tagged?
So because there's a slight distinction between the Shema Kolenu prayer and all the other prayers, because Shema Kolenu just means hear our voice.
Right.
So it has this generic nature. So in Shema Kolenu, there's no issue. You could add anything basically. You could say whatever you want in that thing. And the other blessings, which are more right, exactly, which are more. So the other blessings, which are more theme specific. Rifa'inu, we want healing. Chonin dat, like we want to be wise and smart. Like the things that you add in should be geared towards the theme.
That's cool.
But all the blessings, you can add whatever. You want.
I'm curious. Do you know people that have a practice to add something specific in each blessing relevant to that theme? Is that something you've come across?
So there. Do I know specific individuals you're asking? Do I know of practices?
Either in literature, historically, or
I mean, any Siddur, any Jewish prayer book, you'll see in many of the blessings there are certain blessings that have like inserts that they'll, for instance, with the Rifa'inu prayer for healing. So there is a section there. I'm sure you're familiar with it, where there's a formulation to pray for someone specific, for a specific person who's ill that you want to pray for. But even that specific formulation, that's just something that someone wrote because they thought it would be, easier to, helpful, but you don't have to, say those words. But yes, to answer your question, yes, absolutely. There's it's a very common. And on specific holidays, we also make additions that are, thematic to whatever is going on.
Yeah.
Right. That's why we make those additions. Right. On the holidays. Things referring to the temple, for instance. So we make an addition in that blessing that's related to the holiday.
That's a really great point as well that you're saying now. That for those that aren't familiar, that in Judaism there's an every day, there's a Shabbat at the end of the week on Saturday, and then there's days throughout the year that are specific festivals, and we modulate our prayers based on the day of the year. And sometimes when those days overlap, there's an additional modulation, which is I've never thought about this point before, but. For example, an example which be aware to anyone that is a practicing Jew, when we're making kiddush, we're sanctifying the day over a cup of wine, when it's a Shabbat and a festival, or for the same matter in the Amidah, in the standing prayers, when for a festival we'll add in a word here and a word there. We'll say ba'ahava, with love.
Correct.
It just gets inserted there. And it was always kind of absurd. I mean, it's beautiful. I love saying with love. It's like how I end my emails all that. But why what's this with love that we're adding in the prayer? But the notion is that the prayer is precipitating a particular consciousness for that day, and the way that we can invoke that consciousness is by articulating, and the way to articulate is by changing the ordinary prayer. So when we're stopped in the kiddush and we have to say, oh, ba'ahava or leisha basukah, you're like, oh, there's something happening today. There's something. Yeah. So perhaps perhaps it's an attempt to modulate the liturgy 100%. To keep us conscious of the uniqueness.
In fact, the law is that if a person doesn't pray the specific, Sabbath-oriented prayers, for instance, they fulfill their obligation. That's also, I think, something that's not as well known. A person prays the regular prayers, they fulfill their obligation. Uh-huh. But it's not preferable to do that. Right. You should be praying the Sabbath-oriented prayers because it's talking about the Sabbath.
Yeah, it's relevant to that moment. Yeah. Here's my question. I wanted to ask you a question about when we speak about bringing the divine into the context of everyday life, sort of abstracting away from a colloquial use of the word divine. When we think about the divine in a technical theological sense, we're thinking about divine transcendence, divine omnipotence, divine omniscience, we're thinking about the divine in very specific theological senses. Is there a way that we're talking about imbuing our everyday with that divinity, or are we using divinity in some sort of vague poetic notion? Does that question make sense?
No.
Okay, so
sorry.
Yeah, no.
I was doing my best to follow.
I'll elaborate. I'll be more explicit. We were speaking earlier about imbuing the context of everyday life with the divine, as we've been saying. And the analogy that you gave, we gave two analogies. One was the tzitzit, the fringes on the garment, that we have the ordinary garment, and we deify it by adding tzitzit to it. And we spoke about the meal, that we sit down for a meal, which itself is profound, and then being able to articulate meaning within that context imbues that moment with divinity, with meaning. And this is my question. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we're speaking of God, of the divine, in sort of two different registers. One of them is we're speaking more colloquially and poetically. We're speaking about divinity as care, as love, as meaning, as presence, as all of sort of those good attributes. It's sort of a catchphrase for the good, or the beautiful in sort of that Platonic sense. And then when we speak about God, and we had this earlier in the conversation, we're in the second context, we're speaking about God more theologically, in a more technical sense. God as the ground of being, to be metaphysical. God as to be more theistic, let's say, and more typical, rabbinic and biblical. God is the so they not that those are the same categories at all. But God is as the creator, as the omnipotent, as the omniscient, as the infinite, as the all-knowing, as the figure to which we are incomparable, to which there is a unbridgeable gap between the human and the divine, right? So the first divine is the divine as simply as the good, as the best values in life, the meaningful, and then God as that transcendent, infinite entity in all of its attributes, the unknowable. Is there a sense where we're talking about imbuing the everyday with the divine, where we're speaking not just about divine in the colloquial poetic sense, but we're talking about the divine in the theological, in the strict sense? Does the question? I
think I understand what you're getting at. I would say that that the way of addressing that, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, but let me help a
Sure.
little. It's not just maybe the analogy of the meal and the tzitzit is a difficult one. In the way that we humans function, right? The need to the need to imitate God. Is there the sense that we are participating in the divine or emulating being the merkava to the divine, as we said, in more of a technical sense than a poetic sense? Maybe that's an easier angle into the question.
Well, when we're trying to imitate the divine, as you said, Valachta B'drachav, there's already a gap there because the things that we do are not the things that God does, at least not in the same way. But I think without becoming too abstract, I think this really can get lost in like very technical, abstract, and meaningless words. I think that just a much more practical approach is there is a bottom up, top and top down perspective. I think that most of this conversation has been coming from the bottom up perspective, like how coming from our subjective perspective and how we're going to address that. But there's also a top down in that we recognize that there's something transcendent from us. And I think that both of those things are going on simultaneously. So let me just to hash that out, and using the example that we've been going on with the eating and all the rituals that are in that context. So part of it, as we've spoken out, is to commune with what's going on and have that express itself in the fullest. And that's certainly there very powerfully as we try to lay out. But at the same time, there's also an intentionality of trying to transcend through that. Meaning, it's very good that we're aware that we're all here in relationship, and it's very good that we're all aware of the food. And it was, my experience of pleasure of eating this hamburger is, my vehicle to experiencing the divine, my subjective experience. That's all important. But the whole experience as an experience is also a vehicle to elevate up. Meaning, it's not enough for me to sit at this place where I am now and recognize the divine with where I am now, but also as a mode of springboarding to some other place, right? Like through my simple act of through my act of recognizing the communion at a table and being present with the people and eating with them and recognizing what's going on there, I can now jump to the other level of like recognizing, well, wait, this means that I'm actually connected to everyone outside of this house also. It's not just the people that are in here. Meaning it's a springboard to the next level of awareness. And I think from that perspective, it is also aiming towards the transcendent. Does this address a little bit what you were trying to get at?
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to answer it. And
I think that the key difference is that one is it has a certain type that if we're going to only look at this from the perspective of the subjective, then that means that there's a certain type of complacency there. Meaning, like, this is what's going on, and I've, focused enough in order to recognize what's going on, and I'm going to imbue that with divinity and try to get the most out of it, and but that's it. That's as far as it goes. But then there's another focus in addition to that, which is the yearning to go up, to take it up a notch, and by that you need to recognize that there is something above, detached from where you are right now.
So this opens up a whole bag of worms in terms of metaphors of directionality.
Right, we were talking about that at the beginning.
And this is kind of, there's a phrase, now it's tchilatam b'sofan, there's that Ouroboros where the beginning is wedged in the end. I think we've come back to the beginning of the conversation here. But something that just happened, which I noticed, which is very interesting, was that you were using a directionality of transcendence, of going up, which is something which automatically like rubs me the wrong way because I think of the quest to go in as opposed to go up. But then you sort of clarify that by saying that up is to go out as well. That you're expanding your circles of awareness and association with consciousness.
Yes.
That which also brought up a third point to me, which I didn't realize that when we started the conversation, that in the beginning of the conversation we were talking about the inner and outer, and there was a clear axiology there that the inner was better, the outer was extraneous. And now what we've done is
We've
talking
gone
about
the opposite way.
the opposite direction, that the transcendent is moving out expansively in a positive sense.
I hear that's interesting. There's a quote from the very beginning of Sefer Yetzirah, which is a very, very ancient mystical text that talks about the idea of depth. It's very interesting. Even in English lexicon, when we talk about something, we can say that something which is very powerful in a spiritual sense. We could say that it's very deep. We could also say it's very high.
Yes.
In English,
Yeah.
it's very interesting how right. So the Sefer Yetzirah has a line there. It says there's omek ma'ala. Excuse me, not omek ma'ala. It's omek room, meaning there's the depths of the height. Which is, to say it in English, it's almost like an oxymoron. It doesn't make sense. But what it's saying is that there's a penetrating the layers of awareness in the direction of a transcendent direction. Meaning you're moving away the layers that are hiding the true essence of the thing, but you're going up also, and that it's a higher, quote unquote. Again, we're using the word, but the point is that you're moving away the layers in order to expose the true essence of the thing. And from that perspective, why do we call it going up as opposed to going in? Because that is addressing the reality that there is an element of this that is removed from us, meaning it's removed from our consciousness, at least. It's removed from our fundamental experience right now, and the goal is to get there. Like, we want to get there. So from that perspective, it is a going up.
Interesting. This is very rooted in pantheism discussion, obviously.
Yes.
Removed from us. I want to play with maybe we'll end on this point. I want to play with this notion of the up, down, in, and out, where it sounds so funny to say, where so the notion of going inside spiritually, which has antecedents in Jewish mysticism. We have the Yordei Merkava. The Maaseh Merkava, the mysticism of the chariot, which I mentioned earlier, they're not those that ascend the chariot. They're those that ascend they're those that descend to the chariot. There's a notion of that King David says, "Mimama kim kiratech Hashem," that from the depths, which is taken up in some Jewish practices that the chazan, the person who leads the prayer, the person who has the vision to lead the prayer, is yored lifnei hateva. They descend before the teva. There's a notion of prophecy that the prophet is described in Talmudic literature as the one, and also in the act of repentance, in sort of the greatest moments of repentance in the Talmud, it's where the individual puts their head between their knees and they're toning inwards as far as they can, and that's
it's a return to the fetal position,
right? And that's an internalization where both prophecy and repentance, which are very much phenomenologically intertwined, are found. So I think that the notion of talking about an inner directed spirituality is not just some new age mumbo jumbo. It's actually something which with very, very old, deep Jewish roots. But this notion of the collapse of directionality of the inner and outer, where just to focus on the inner, to quote Pirkei Avot, which has been a running theme here, that if I'm only for myself, what am I? But if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? The notion that if the direction is only focused on the internalized, that becomes the megalomania, that becomes the egoism which sees nothing else, and that's not, there's no capability of life there, meaningfulness. But if I'm only outward directed, right, then all I care is about reputation, all I care is about how people perceive me, then I have no inner life, so that need to somehow merge and combine that the inner and outer directionality and the upper and lower directionality, where going up means going down, like you said. It's the omek, it's the
omek room,
and
the depths of height.
This notion of mala maila mala mata, that as above so below, which is a Kabbalistic idea or a Hermetic idea, and the inner and outer, where the quest into our own nullification becomes one of integration, the quest into our own expansion becomes one of interiorization. I think there's a lot of work to be done poetically and metaphorically with those directionalities. Yeah,
for sure. These are all an attempt to describe a facet of the phenomenology, and it's always a mistake to think that it's describing the totality of it. This is the theme mystically. Again, not to get too much into technical, especially since we're about to finish up, but this is the mystical idea, as often referred to as Partzufim, as of faces, the face, meaning the facet, right? So, imagine a gem and that has many, like a cut diamond that has many faces, and as you turn it, so like the light is reflecting off of that one face. But imagine a face. It's difficult to imagine such an object, but imagine that whenever you turn the object, whatever face you're looking at appears like it's the whole object.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is like a Mandelbrot, set. People are familiar with mathematics, but there's like the idea is that one facet of the thing contains the totality of it, and it seems like it is the totality, but it's not. It requires a constant stepping back to appreciate the multiple facets of the thing. So when we talk about going up, going down, going in, going out, those are all elements of the totality of the experience and the fullness of it, which is ultimately the mystery. The mystery is the ineffable mystery is it's ineffable because all we can do are describe the Partzufim. All we can do are describe the facets. It's very difficult to articulate. Almost impossible, I would think, to articulate how those facets are actually joined together. So yes, we can talk distinctly about the going up and going down versus going down. We can talk distinctly about the going out as opposed to going in, and how those join together is a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. I love that idea. The idea of the that the all is in the all, that in each aspect of the all, and this is the notion of the Kabbalists speak about that that essence by its nature. When you take a hold of any part of it, you're taking a hold of any of it because it's essential, and therefore it's indivisible, and any part of it is the whole. Which is a notion which is replete throughout Eastern and Western mysticism, where the any particular is sort of this holographic image of the totality. I think William Blake puts this very well in a poem. He says that to see eternity. How's it go? To see eternity in an hour, to see the world in a wild flower, and to hold eternity. I'm
pretty sure it's to hold eternity in an hour. Yeah.
To see all of existence in a wild flower, and the world in a grain, the world in a grain of sand, and eternity in a wild flower.
Yeah,
I'm butchering it. Here, I'll put it on the screen. But that notion I think the notion that you ended with, that the particular is an image of the totality, but it's not. The mystery is the totality of the totality.
Correct.
And the sort of the tension in Jewish pantheism, as we began with, is to both to recognize the divine in the particular, in the moment, in the here and now, but also to realize that there's a transcendent, all-encompassing divine, which is the mystery that connects all of those parts of him.
Yes, absolutely. Well said.
Epic. Do you have any final thoughts, any final words for the camera before we conclude?
I think to hammer home what we were kind of dancing around the whole time is that in the end of the day, any regimen of practice that we follow has this end goal in mind. Like there's something behind it. In classical Jewish thought, we're very hesitant to definitively claim this is the reason for a particular practice. And despite the fact that is true, we can. I think it's important to still understand that this is a practice for something. Like no one would walk into a martial arts gym and see them, doing their kata with their very distinct formulated moves and think, yeah, they're here to learn how to do this. That's not what they're here to learn. This is studying in order to produce something. Like the collective of all of what's going on here is going to produce something that's more than the sum of its parts, and something will emerge from that. And again, as we said, to maintain that awareness in practice is what allows that to emerge. And I think that's the attitude that we have to have when addressing practice, especially from a Hebrew perspective where practice is so central. It's so central. Like the practice, like the doing. The doing is absolutely essential and central. Yeah. Essential and central. And it's for that reason, because it allows it to emerge. It allows it to, come out into expression. But it's maintaining that awareness that I think allows that to happen.
Nice. Thanks for bringing it back to practice. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Is there any final question? Is there any place where you are sharing material online that people that have listened all the way to the end of the conversation?
You are going to help me out with that, because that seems to be the hurdle of mine.
Good. Let's do that. So I'm going to, God willing, we're going to sit down and I'm going to try and help you get that stuff on Amazon. Not on Amazon, on Anchor. And it'll be available on podcasts. So maybe by the time this gets published, there'll be a link down here in the description and people can find that material.
Awesome. Great.
Shammai?
This is great, man.
Yeah. Thanks for sitting down with me.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
Until next time.
That was really cool. Wow. That was so much fun. That was
Really good.